Okay, the lesson today is how to put custom behavior in your game. Here's the general recipe for your custom behavior. First, you create a custom variable and assign it to something like 0 or 100, whatever makes sense. For instance, if it was life points, you would have an initial value of 100 and it goes down to 0. Or score would be something that starts at 0 and just goes up. Um, then number 2, it says here, update the custom variable with new values that reflect changes in the game. So when objects collide, that's usually something that might, that could be a case where the score could change or the life points go down or something else in the game. And then lastly, you use the value of the custom variable to make decisions about what actions your game system needs to take. So let's say you have a time-based game, and the challenge of the game is to get 100 points within as little time as possible. That means when the score is 100, then you're going to find that you're going to have to test for that variable versus 100, and if its score is greater than or equal to 100, then you can stop the game and tell them how fast that they completed it in. So this is a little complicated, this next section. Gdevelop doesn't have a simple approach to variables. They each have something called their own scope, and so let me get into it and see if we can make some sense of this. So if you're making custom variables, the most widely available category would be the global variables. An example of this would be a score variable or some basic value like true and false. And the positive thing about a global variable, especially in game development, it makes it really simple for anyone who has working on a scene, especially if there's multiple people working on different scenes. They can all access the same thing to create changes in the score variable. You run into problems if somebody uses the score variable for their own custom needs that don't exactly have to do with the score. They might temporarily change it and then set it back, and so there is some risk of that. So global in some ways is the most error-prone way to have variables. But in the small-scale projects that we're using with just a few global variables, we probably won't run into any problems. Specifically, true and false as values, those are normally built into some kind of a set of constant values that the game engine uses in its language, in the programming language. The key here is that they just have to be different values, and you have to treat them as constants, where you're not, by convention, you're just, as a programmer, going to set a new variable to true. Later on, it'll become false, and you never change the values of true and false. You just treat them by convention as two values that are different from one another, and that will stay the same. So then there's in each room or level, which in Gdevelop they call that a scene. Each scene has its own set of variables that when you start the scene, even if two scenes have the same names for scene variables, they have their own version of that variable. And normally you just check if when the scene is beginning, you can set a value for those. So that's one way to be doubly sure that your scene variables in the beginning of your scene start the way you want them to be, with the right values. We're going to use something called a walk delay timer. So in this game, the player is going to move an avatar around, and that character, while you're holding down the arrow keys in one direction, you don't want it to go 60 frames a second in that direction, because that's how fast it could be. This is going to be a little bit like a retro game in the movement, and so there will be, let's say, a third of a second delay that we will use for walking, so that you'll be able to walk, let's say, 3 squares in the grid each second. And that walk timer, the next thing, it's going to be set to 0.33 seconds, and then each iteration going through the game engine's code, it will get smaller and smaller until exactly 0.33 seconds or more have passed. And that might be different on like a inexpensive laptop versus a high-end desktop. Most machines will probably be 60 frames a second, so that will be 20 frames or 20 steps of going through the code. So this is a countdown timer. Then we'll use this thing called play walk sound as a Boolean value that can only be true or false up here. And whenever we're walking, the moment that we walk to the right or left or up and down, we'll play a sound, and then during the delay, we will not play sounds, and so we'll have to keep track of those true-false values. And then inside of scenes, there's a scene count-up timer, which has some limitations, and it can only count up. And for some reason, they put quotes around this type of variable. But you can, what they call instantiate, which means simply create a variable, at any point in your game. You put that as a count-up timer, and you put quotes around it, and you tell the system to start that timer or pause it. And later on, you can see how big it is. And when it passes a certain amount of time, what we're going to do is go to the next level. So rather than going to the next level immediately, we'll put a delay in there, and that'll create an opportunity to play a sound, and you could even add different custom effects for graphics. And then each object can have one or more variables that are custom, that are not normally part of the objects, but you added to them. So I'm doing this x old and y old for the coordinates that the object was on previously. And I'll show you why this makes sense. It's to prevent having the character move into a wall. The code will try to move the object, test to see if there's like a wall collision, and then back up to x old, y old whenever there is a collision. So all of these have different notation, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. But this is just a good example of all the different types of variables that you have, and this combination of a walk delay timer and a walk timer, those two things together will be very useful in a game where you have any kind of cool-off timer, where you're not allowing the player to do something 60 times a second, like create some sort of object that, like if the avatar is shooting water, he can't do that every single step. He can only do it when his energy builds up, and you'll come up with a time like once a second. So you'd have to time it such that if your character is going to be, your player avatar character is going to be too powerful, you put in some delay timers for cooling off weapons or defense mechanisms or anything that you need to balance out the game. Okay, so in part A, you need to download the file that has all the assets and extract it to a folder. And then this is going to be the folder where your Gdevelop project can be, and that's really convenient. Inside of the text file that's there called checklist, you'll be able to see all the summary of all the things that you're going to be putting into the game. And there's a certain order putting things into the game, it makes sense specifically to do that such that the what's called the Z order, which is what is in front versus in back, that's what's necessary to make things really easy. Um, so let's make a empty project and put it into the directory where all the assets already are. For me, that's a subdirectory beneath my downloads directory. You can use whatever directory you want. Okay, and then there's some global settings here. I think um, the there's two different things, properties and global variables. So we're going to create global variables for score, true, and false. So initially score is going to be 0, true is going to be the number 1, and false will be 0. That's true and false as 0 and 1, as 1 and 0 respectively. That's the way that in the C language, that in old versions of it, you actually had to create a variable for true and another one for false. So under the resolution and rendering settings of the project properties, we're going to make a smaller game because it's more retro, and use a 640 by 480 as the width and the height of the game. And I think that's about it there. And then we need to apply that, and then start making some scenes and objects. So in the scene, actually the something important, if we have music, that the introduction scene is going to show that there's a music setting for that we will need to set. So let's say the title screen will be the first level. We'll have some game information and show a little bit of the game world. And then we're going to have the music just keep going from level to level. So I think on some versions of Gdevelop you might have a grid that's, I don't know, 40 by 40. But here we'll use 32 by 32 there. And that makes it very simple once the grid is turned on to place objects where they line up, kind of like a checkerboard. Okay, so all of these objects are in a certain order. So the background object will be first. It's a tiled sprite, and that allows you to make it tall or skinny or just like a big rectangle, and it will just repeat the same image again and again. And there's an image background.png, as almost all of these I think are going to say exactly the same name as we'll use for the object. And so for this it's fine to use 32 by 32, and you can make it any size you want because that's the nature of tiled sprites. They just repeat. And so there's another type of game element we have that was just sitting on top of that background will be a wall object. So the wall object we're just going to use in the first part just a one version of the wall. Unlike the regular sprite, the tiled sprite doesn't have different animations to go between. So we will possibly look at that towards the end, where you can have different types of walls to simulate or hint at some kind of architecture, structural features of your game levels. Then we're going to, let's see here, do a sprite after this one is applied. Let's see, I think it's temporary wall. So this is going to be a regular sprite, and the temporary wall is kind of like a wall that's red, so it looks kind of that there's an obvious difference with that and the regular walls. And we'll put in some mechanism where that has kind of, it can be moved away or destroyed as an object, which is deleting an object from the game, really. So then there's a hole object. We need to put the image there. So then there's a boulder after the whole object. Okay, apply that. Then there's a bomb. I think the bomb is going to look like a stick of dynamite. Then there's a goal object, which is like a flag. Oh, we need the image for the goal object. Then there's a trigger. Oh, the trigger image looks like a metal box with a handle on top. Then there's a diamond object. This will be the collectible that will be worth points. Okay, applied that. Then there's some monsters next. Let's do, let's see, a spider. And then another monster, a ghost. So then the person object is going to be more complicated. Let's see, the ghost needs its artwork. And then, so the person needs 4 different pieces of artwork. So let's do that. So with animations, where actually, even if it's a still image, you can name frame, so the first set of frames, the second set of frames. And we're not going to bother with animation. We're just going to have 4 different single frame images. And that will be something that we can name based on the direction that they're facing. So let's get the image that's facing to the right, and then open that. The next one is going to be facing up, I guess. And then facing left, finally. And then there's, for the score, I guess, there can be a little bitty diamond, a smaller diamond. And you put that just to the side of the text that shows the score. And that'll be like a user interface object. putting in the background. Let's drag it to the scene and actually turn on the grid. So that way be easy to align everything. So this is missing a text user interface for the text. Let's do that. So I'm going to go to a text file and pick up some text for the ending and the introduction. Actually, let's see here. What should we do next? Yeah, let's just make some walls, top, bottom, left, and right. We can certainly just think of this as placeholder artwork, and can do more with it later. Once you actually have placed an object, you can copy and paste it with Control C, Control V, and then you can drag the one. It might be on top of one another a little bit, so then you have to drag the one that you just pasted off to the side. I just copied and pasted again. Next, we're going to make another level based on this. So we'll just jump to the end. We'll duplicate a level here, and you have to go through these menus to rename things. You can also move them, the different levels, different scenes actually is what they call them. The different scenes can be moved up and down, and there is the simplest way to move through these Gdevelop games is from the first scene to the second scene to the next scene, and then finally when you're on the last scene you can put in an action to end the game. So you can customize anything on the title screen or ending screen with the artwork. I will use a text, the user interface text to put something different for the first level versus the last level, and maybe a few other objects. Okay, so from this point on, we need to look at actions. I guess we could probably get away with just two actions on the title screen. The first one I'm going to search for is the playing music or playing a sound in a loop. So it's at the very beginning of the scene is when I want to start the music. And so that action is, you can find it under audio and play a music file. The .ogg extension is very similar to the .mp3. It's not proprietary, so there's no licensing fee for hardware manufacturers to play .ogg files or OGG files. I'm going to make the sound repeating, so it's constantly in the background. I'm going to set the volume to 40. I actually have never used the pitch thing. I think was it a value of 1 here is like multiplying the expected pitch by 1 so no changes are occurring. I guess you could get chipmunk sounds if you make it faster, greater than 1. And then when you press any key, you're going to go to start the game in the proper levels. So you can type in A and Y for any, and then any key pressed would be the way to check for the moment that you want to go to the next scene actually here. So under scenes you have some options, and the little sort of aqua and blue arrow to the right, you can just jump to any scene. You don't actually have to go in order, but it's kind of simpler to do that. And